unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
Orlando the Marmalade Cat. Orlando keeps a dog. Orlando took his dear wife Grace and their 3 kittens, the Snow-White Blanche, Pansy the Tortoiseshell, and Little Black Tinkle, for a walk one fine winter's day. This was not so simple as it sounds, for cats seldom walk in a straight line. They find so much to interest them on the way that they zigzag from stone to leaf and from insect to toadstool. Sometimes it takes cats a long time to go a short distance. Orlando and Grace padded softly side by side, with their tails twined together. They never bumped into each other, nor fell out of step, for they were always interested in the same thing at the same moment. It was different with the kittens. They had to jump in the air to avoid collisions, and Tinkle got in the way every time. "Look where you're going," said Blanche severely.
"I am doing,"
Tinkle replied crossly, and fell over backwards. A fat little robin, like a russet apple on 2 wires, perched on a tree above Tinkle as he lay on his back.
"Ooh, I want it,"
he mewed excitedly. "I have told you 100 times, Tinkle, that you cannot have a bird," said Orlando.
"Well, I must have somebody to love,"
Tinkle muttered sulkily. Grace reminded him that he had his sisters.
"Pooh, who wants to love girls?"
he said scornfully, scrambling to his feet. Blanche was furious.
"I like that. Who embroidered the crest on your blazer pocket? And who reads to you when you're ill in bed with nothing the matter?" asked Pansy angrily. "That's girls' work," and Tinkle swaggered along with his nose in the air. Orlando looked at him thoughtfully. "Of course," he said. "Quite a lot of tomcats think that way, but they only get laughed at for it." "Then I'm not going to love anybody that laughs at me."
Tinkle lagged behind and tried to whistle as though he didn't care. But the corners of his mouth turned down, and the wrong noise came out.
"I'm so lonely that I shall have to make up some poetry to comfort myself with," he said to himself. "Little Robin Redbreast, how you love me so,"
he sang. But he couldn't think of the right word to rhyme with breath.
"Oh, poor Tinkle,"
he went on.
"I am sorry for you."
The others went on ahead until it was time to turn homewards for tea. On their way back they found Tinkle, who was packing some mud round a worm which he had put in an old matchbox. "Come along, old fellow, and bring your treasure with you," said Orlando.
"'Tisn't treasure," mumbled Tinkle. "It's a pet what I'm going to love. It's Wormintrude, and when it dies I'm going to have it stuffed. Pooh! Girls!"
Blanche and Pansy asked Orlando if they too could have a pet.
"How can we love Tinkle?"
And there were tears in their eyes. Orlando and Grace thought that the kittens really did seem to need something new to interest them, and they did not think Wormintrude could hold Tinkle's affection for long. Orlando suggested several kinds of animals, but the kittens could not agree. "What about a baby boy?" said Grace.
"No boys, thank you," objected Blanche and Pansy hastily. "I'd like a kangaroo," Tinkle decided. "I'd use its pouch to mix cement in, and when I've finished with it, the girls can have it as a work basket."
But neither Blanche nor Pansy wanted a work basket. When they got home, Orlando asked Master to put a notice in the newspaper telling any animal that wanted a job as a pet to call and see the cats. Then the kittens could choose the one they liked best. Master wrote out this notice on his typewriter. Pet wanted for 3 kittens. Must be clean, honest, and loving. Apply Orlando. Tinkle watched Master typing and sighed longingly.
Oh, I wish I had a triper.
Do stop wanting things all the time, grumbled Blanche.
I can't help it. I'm growing so fast that I need things to fill up my gaps with,
Tinkle replied sadly. Suddenly his sisters felt sorry for him. They hugged and kissed him, and the 3 kittens were friends once more. Two days later, when the cats were eating their breakfast, the doorbell rang and the knocker banged. The animals who had read the notice in the newspaper had begun to arrive. A frog and a lovely green snake squeezed through the letterbox and fell on the floor with a flop. Orlando nervously opened the door, and instantly the room was filled with furry, feathered, and scaly creatures of every shape and size. They all shouted at the tops of their voices how honest they were, how clean, and how loving. Suddenly, the dining room grew dark, and there was a noise of broken glass as a hippopotamus pushed her head through the window and said, "Here I be, loving and honest and fond of me bath." The poor cats were squeezed into a corner, as yet more animals crowded in. The garden was packed tight with pets, and many others swarmed along the road. Grace and the kittens were frightened. Orlando did not know what to do, and Master had gone out. Just in time, however, a black dog, covered with tiny curls, forced his way into the room and barked at the pets. They looked scared and began to back out. They scrambled over and under each other, pushed and shoved faster and faster as the dog barked more and more fiercely. Soon the eager faces and bright eyes disappeared, and all that could be seen were twirling tails, flashing hooves, and scampering pads. A cinnamon-coloured cat with amber eyes, however, stayed close to the dog. The last to go was an ostrich, who had buried his head in Grace's flower pot and had been fast asleep. The room was light again, and the air was cooler, though full of floating feathers, tufts of hair, and strange scents. Thoroughly pleased with himself, the dog stretched his hind legs, and the cinnamon-coloured cat copied him. He stretched his front legs, and the cinnamon-coloured cat did likewise. The dog wagged his tail, which was tufted like a little palm tree. His nose reminded Tinkle of a fat, wet prune. He laughed, and the tip of his long pink tongue was shaped like an iris petal. There was a patch of white curls on his chest, as though he wore a tiny ostrich feather. He smelt deliciously of warm dog biscuits. He rolled his chestnut-coloured eyes mischievously, showing white corners like little crescents of hard-boiled egg. "We wish to apply for the job," he said, speaking for the cinnamon-coloured cat as well. "Sometimes we're honest, and sometimes we're clean, but we're always loving." The dog cocked his head on one side. "We feel a bit playful now that we've finished protecting you and all that. Shall we chase you and give you a good rousing tousle? You look rather solemn, you know." "Wait a minute," Orlando said sharply. "I know nothing about you. And anyhow, we only want one pet." "Oh, dash it, old boy," the dog barked. "I need a pet myself. And my cat, he's called Flute, is a jolly useful sort of pet. In fact, he's my copy-cat, or secretary, if you like it better." "I'm just the chap you want," he pleaded. "Very sporty and all that. You won't have a dull moment while I'm around, 'cause I love chasing cats." The dog made a sudden movement towards Orlando, and Grace clasped the kittens tightly to her. Orlando arched his back and hissed. The dog stopped in surprise, and Flute looked nervous. "What is your name?" Orlando asked severely. "Bill," the dog answered. "And a fine old French name to suit an elegant Frenchman like myself." "A thoroughly English name," Orlando corrected. "Not a bit of it, old boy. All the best dogs in Paris are called Bill, which is French for Bill." Orlando thought Bill's manners were very rough and rude, and he would have sent him away at once if he hadn't saved them all from such a tight corner. "Why did you leave your last place?" "Through no fault of mine. I belonged to a baby, but whenever I licked him he just fell over, so I had to leave." "What kind of dog are you?" "I'm a very fine poodle, old boy, wearing my country suit." In the envelope, tied to my collar, there's a photo of me in my town clothes, which will prove it. Orlando gingerly walked up to Bill and undid the envelope. The kittens laughed when they saw the picture of Bill, and even their parents smiled behind their whiskers. He looked so funny with pom-poms on his hips, thick woolly trousers, a shaven face with drooping moustaches, and a top-knot on his head tied with ribbon. Bill's eyes turned dark with anger, and they gleamed like blue-black grapes. "I will not be laughed at," he barked, for he hated to be a figure of fun. He sprang at the cats, and in a second they were on the top of the dresser. "Now jolly well stay there till I tell you to come down," he growled. It grew late, and the sun began to set.
"I'm hungry,"
whispered Tinkle.
"Some wee,"
squeaked his sisters. Orlando took a silver box that lay near him and opened it. He handed it to his family. "Cigars?" murmured Grace in surprise. "Take one," whispered Orlando. "They're smaddocks, rolled smoked haddock skins. Very nourishing. I keep a store of them on all the high furniture in the house for just such an emergency as this." To Grace's fury, Bill threw himself on her beautiful blue satin sofa and picked up her ivory-white telephone to ring up his lost home. "I've got the new job," he yapped down the receiver, but the only answer he got was a bubbling gurgle, for the baby was sucking the other end. "You certainly have not got this job," hissed Orlando, and his eyes blazed like electric green gooseberries. "Oh, everybody loves me," Bill smugly replied, lolling on the sofa. "I'm a rattling good fella." He fell asleep and jerked his legs as though he were riding a bicycle. Flute liked the new job, and he knew that if he wished to stay, he must be nice to Orlando. "Can I help you?" he whispered. "Yes, bring us some stilts from Mr. Cattermole's cat shop. Then we can walk about, out of Bill's reach," Orlando answered. Flute crept out of the house without waking Bill, and was back again very soon, with elegant little bamboo stilts, topped by green velvet pincushions for the cats to fasten their claws onto. Orlando and his family stepped carefully onto the stilts and stalked unsteadily out of the room. Unfortunately, Tinkle giggled. Bill woke up to see the cats wobbling along the garden path. He dashed after them, and in their fright they fell over, their stilts waving in the air. "Drop the stilts! Climb the nearest tree!" Orlando hissed. The cats threw away their stilts and streaked across the lawn and up a pussy willow tree just in time. Bill glowered up at them, but he could only see their eyes glowing in the sunset. Orlando had an idea. "If you will promise to behave yourself, Bill, we will take you for a walk tomorrow." At the word walk, Bill put his head on one side and one back leg trembled with excitement. "Say that again, old boy, with your paw on your heart, and promise," he said. "If you will stop chasing us and calling me old boy, I promise faithfully that we will take you for a walk tomorrow." Bill lay flat on his back to show that he had no more mischief left in him. "I will be your devoted slave, old—" "Sir, I mean." The cats climbed down the tree, and Bill followed them respectfully into the house. Grace served the supper, and Bill sat humbly beside her. They all spent a peaceful evening together, though sometimes Bill rolled his eyes mischievously and showed the little white crescents of hard-boiled egg. A stern look from Orlando, however, sobered him at once. "Oh dear," sighed Grace, "I have positively nothing to wear on the walk tomorrow. I think I'd better go to Mr. Catamole and buy a coat and skirt." "Do, my dear," said Orlando. "And a basket for me to sleep in," Bill pleaded, "for I do want this job. I love you all simply frightfully, you know." Mr. Catamole had just the thing for Grace. A tweed costume with a neat waist, padded shoulders, and a fancy cap to match. Her soft body filled the curves and fitted comfortably into the shaped jacket. No alterations were necessary. She bought a pair of gloves, a lead, and asked Mr. Catamole to send on the clothes she had come in, with a basket for Bill. Grace felt so gay in her new costume that when she reached the garden gate, she tried to jump over it instead of creeping underneath as usual. Her skirt got caught, and for an alarming moment she hung by the hem in mid-air. But she wriggled herself free and managed to enter the house the right way up. "How lovely you look, my dear," Orlando exclaimed. "It was rather expensive," Grace said apologetically, "but it will last forever, of course." The next morning was fine and frosty, and an inch of snow had fallen during the night. The blue sky was flecked with fluffy clouds like white poodles. It was indeed a dog's day. As Grace smoothed her new jacket over her hips, her fur crackled with electricity. "That lovely costume just needs a smart poodle to go with it," Orlando remarked. "You must lead Bill, my dear." Grace buckled the lead onto the dog's collar, and one of his legs trembled with impatience. Orlando helped the kittens to put on their outdoor clothes, while Flute sat and watched. Oddly enough, he showed no signs of wanting to go with Bill. "I'll stay at home," he said, "in case the telephone rings while you're out." The kittens begged him to come, but he was full of excuses, and Bill grinned at him with a knowing look. "Now we're off," said Grace, when they were all ready. Off was the right word. Bill dashed through the front door and raced out of the garden, throwing his legs and ears in all directions. Grace was instantly whirled off her feet and whizzed through the air. She clutched the lead with one paw and held her cap on with the other. Sometimes her hind feet touched the ground, and being a cat, she managed to keep her balance. Orlando and the kittens were left far behind. Grace very soon began to enjoy this strange way of travelling. She didn't have to think about which way to go, and she hardly had to use her feet at all. "I feel so happy," she purred. "My heart is like a harp, with the wind blowing tunes upon it." Suddenly Bill stopped to scratch himself, and Grace sat down with a bump. She took the opportunity to tidy herself. Bill asked her if she liked rabbiting. "Well, I've never hunted anything bigger than a mouse," she modestly replied, "except when I was a mad thing in my young days." Her eyes sparkled as she thought of those carefree ratting raids out of school hours. "Then come along with me, madam. I'll show you some fun." Bill led Grace up a bank to a gap in the hedge. In the field just below them sat a rabbit, who twitched his nose impudently at Bill. But when for the first time in his life he saw a cat wearing a cap, he kicked up a shower of snow and disappeared from sight. Off flew Bill and Grace after the rabbit. They raced over ploughed fields that looked like white corduroy, past trees wearing mittens and jerseys of ivy. They followed the tracks of the rabbit round a snow-covered haystack that reminded Bill of an iced cake. They were startled by what they thought was a strange beast with antlers, swishing his tail and stamping. But it was only Orlando's friend, Vulcan, the horse, who was scratching his head against a fallen branch. Bill dashed along, his nose to the ground. He followed the rabbit's footprints, which seemed to say, "Ha-ha, you can't catch me!" Every turn and twist tipped Grace's cap over her nose or onto the back of her head, but she loved every minute of it. Suddenly the rabbit disappeared into his burrow. Bill and Grace came to a sudden stop and fell in a heap. They could hear the rabbit humming a teasing little tune far down underground. Bill looked rather foolish. "It's a funny thing," he grinned, "but do you know, I've never yet been able to catch a rabbit." Grace suddenly remembered Orlando and the kittens. "We must go home at once," she said. "They'll be worried about us." "Good," replied Bill. "I'll take you home. Trust me." And after sniffing the air this way and that for a clue to the right direction, he had to admit they were lost. "Blow me down. We'll have to take a taxi," he said. This was all very well, but you don't find taxis in ploughed fields. All at once there was a piercing shriek in the distance. Bill pricked up his ears. "Hooray! That's old Mrs. Puffle-Chuffle, the railway train. She'll take us home. Let's run and catch her." He whisked Grace across the field, through the hedge, and along a road until they reached a railway bridge. Mrs. Puffle-Chuffle, in her shiny black bodice, with grey smoke hair streaming from her head, rumbled under the bridge towards the nearby station. Bill raced after her and dashed down the stairs onto the platform. Grace sailed sweetly after him, and together they climbed into one of Mrs. Puffle-Chuffle's carriages. The guard blew his whistle, and she blew hers. Then she trundled off, panting, "Puffle-Chuffle, Puffle-Chuffle, Puffle-Chuffle, Puffle-Chuffle," all the time, with an occasional shriek with which to liven herself up. Meanwhile, Orlando had wasted no time. The moment that his dear wife was whisked from his sight, he told the kittens to stay with Flute while he rescued Grace. Blanche and Pansy burst into tears.
"Oh, you silly wet things,"
said Tinkle scornfully. Orlando jumped into his car and drove off at top speed. He soon caught sight of Bill bounding over the countryside with Grace in her skirt ballooning in the air after him. He sped along a road that led in the same direction, but arrived at the station just too late to prevent Mrs. Puffle-Chuffle carrying them off in the wrong direction. He drove madly after the train beside the railway track. The passengers were thrilled by the race and cheered Orlando on. Neither Grace nor Bill looked out of their window, so they did not see Orlando. "I do hope this is the way home," said Grace anxiously. "Don't you fret, madam. I'm always right," Bill answered. Orlando and Mrs. Puffle-Chuffle reached the next station together. Grace saw him and sprang out of the window, jerking Bill after her. Orlando was so angry with the poodle that he could not speak to him, and they all climbed into the car and drove home in complete silence. Tinkle had begun to miss his mother and was crying.
"Ha! You silly wet thing!"
laughed Pansy and Blanche.
"Here she is."
Bill was so ashamed of himself that he hid in his basket.
"Oh, how could you treat our mother so?"
asked the kitten sadly.
"We were all getting so fond of you."
"She enjoyed herself all right," muttered Bill. "She likes a bit of sport, and she doesn't get much around here that I can see."
"Well, we didn't enjoy it," they said. "We thought we'd lost her, and so did Father."
Unlike dogs, cats never feel ashamed, and it worried Orlando to see Bill so miserable. After all, he hadn't been wicked, only high-spirited, and Grace looked so well and happy after her adventure. Orlando thought of a way to cheer him up. He folded some stiff, shiny paper in half and cut out a back view of himself with the fold down the center. He wrote Orlando in orange ink along the crease inside and pressed the two sides together. The blotted writing looked like the markings of a cat. He wrote Grace on a smaller cat and pressed it in the same way. He then did Pansy, Blanche, and Tinkle, using pale blue ink for Blanche. He also made a paper poodle, but wrote Bill several times all over one half to make marks like curls. Orlando folded them the opposite way and stood them up. Bill laughed at the paper cats and stood the poodle in his basket. He was so glad to be forgiven that he tried from that moment onwards to be good. He always called Orlando Sir, and very often Dear, dear Sir. At night he guarded the haddock in the larder from cat burglars. In the daytime he went shopping with Grace and carried her bag. Every week he took her for a walk, or rather a whiz, and she would come home with sparkling eyes and a grand appetite. Grace was able to do her housework and cooking in half the usual time, for Bill kept the kittens amused. If they were cross, he knew tricks that would make them laugh, such as wearing Master's bowler hat, or pushing his head through the clump of pampas grass and pretending he was a green poodle. He looked very funny, with the pampas plumes waving over his head and his tail sticking out. Flute always copied everything that Bill did and made the kittens laugh all over again. Never again did Bill chase the cats, and though he was very playful, he was careful not to hurt or frighten them. They grew to love their pet and his secretary very dearly, and could not have done without them.
"Father,"
Tinkle said to Orlando one day,
"I know what I'm going to be when I grow up. I'm going to be a pet. It's much the easiest way to earn a liver." "Living, you mean,"
corrected Pansy.
"Oh, it's dreadful the way you're always right,"
grumbled Tinkle.
"Anyhow, you can all start kissing me now, 'cause that's part of the learning how. Then I'll go to Oxford and Cambridge and learn how to be a pet, along with all the other students."
Orlando buys a cottage. Orlando is very beautiful, striped like marmalade and the same color, with eyes as green as gooseberries. On the last day of summer, he lay in a hammock in the treetops, with his dear wife Grace beside him. Their 3 kittens, Tortoiseshell Pansy, Snow White Blanche, and little black Tinkle played among the branches. The house the cats had always lived in was called Rabbit's Pillow, but it was too big for them to look after, and Master had become too old to weed the huge garden. Orlando was worn out with keeping the large rooms free from mice, and Grace's tail ached from beating all the rugs. Master called the cats to come down, as he wanted to speak to them.
"Must be dinner time,"
mewed Tinkle greedily, and he skittered down the tree trunk, hoping for something to eat. Tinkle mewed so piteously that Master gave him a shrimp out of his pocket to keep him quiet. Orlando and Grace climbed down, followed by Pansy and Blanche. "You, Grace," said Master, "have too much housework to do, and Orlando has too much mousework. We must move into a cottage." The cats were miserable, for they dearly loved Rabbit's Pillow.
"It's our home,"
sobbed the kittens.
"It's the most beautiful house in the world."
"Rabbit's Pillow isn't the only lovely house," said Master kindly. "Your father will soon find another." That night Orlando went to Mr. Cat-O-Mole's magic cat shop, which only opens at midnight, and where cats can buy anything they want. "I need an old cottage," he told Mr. Cat-O-Mole. "It must be old, because nearly all new ones are ugly, and the garden must be small." "I have exactly what you want," smiled Mr. Cat-O-Mole. "Go and see it. Here's the key, and the address is Pussy Villa, Furry Hill, Tomford." The next morning Orlando drove a long way in his car, until at last he came to a charming village on the top of a steep little hill, where he found Pussy Villa. It was a lovely old cottage built of stone, the colour of a Siamese cat. Orlando unlocked the door and went inside. There was a cosy sitting-room with a huge fireplace nearly as big as a room itself, and dear little bedrooms upstairs. Orlando loved the cottage, and it was just what Master wanted, though the floors and roof badly needed mending. The little garden was the right size, with an old tree covered with ivy. Among the leaves was a tiny door labelled Todd House, for Todd is the name for a bushy growth of ivy. Like all happy homes, Pussy Villa had its own Robin, and he lived in Todd House. Out he popped to welcome Orlando. Alas, at the end of the garden was a large field which belonged to Pussy Villa. Orlando knew that Master would never buy a cottage with so much land, and sadly he drove home. Sure enough, when Master was told about the field, he refused to buy Pussy Villa. Orlando was very disappointed, for he knew it would be difficult to find another home as charming. Suddenly an enormous letter arrived for Orlando. It was sealed with a hoof mark pressed into a blob of red clay. It was too big for the letter-box, and Master had to open it for Orlando with the bread-knife. The letter was from the cat's old friend, Vulcan the cart-horse. This is what the letter said. "Dear Ollie, me and my wife Venus and our son Cupid want to live in the country. Do you know of a field where we could live? Yours faithfully, Vulcan." Orlando seized Grace round her waist and danced a jig, for he had an idea. "If the horses lived in the field belonging to Pussy Villa," he said to Master, "they'd keep it tidy by eating the weeds and grass." "A very good idea," replied Master. "We'll all go at once to see the cottage." Grace and the kittens loved Pussy Villa, and so did Master. Orlando ran to the village post office and sent 3 telegrams, one to Mr. Cat-O-Mole to say that Master would buy the cottage, another to Vulcan to tell him he could have the field, and the third to the builders, asking them to start mending the floors and roof at once. Then Master began to worry. "I haven't any money to pay for Pussy Villa until I've sold Rabbit's pillow. Oh, I do wish you hadn't sent those telegrams, Orlando." "Well, it's done now," purred Orlando. "It's no use crying over spilt milk. It should be lapped up and not wasted." However, Mr. Catamole soon sold Rabbit's pillow for Master to a rich rabbit. Master arranged to stay with friends and to put the cats into a cat's hotel until Pussy Villa was mended and ready to be lived in. They implored Master to take them with him, but he explained that his friends kept dogs, and dogs chase cats. Orlando and Grace sorted out what to take to Pussy Villa and what must be thrown away, for there was much less room than at Rabbit's pillow. They kept their wedding photograph, Pansy's first cork, Blanche's first doll, and Tinkle's first blazer. Except for their furniture, the cats made a bonfire of everything else. The cats were determined not to be parted from Master, so that night they hid in the suitcase he had packed to take with him. Tinkle put his pet spider in his pocket, and Grace took a bottle of warm haddock milk, in case the kittens were thirsty in the night. In the morning the furniture removers came and took everything away in a huge van to be stored in their storehouse until Pussy Villa was ready. They took Master's suitcase by mistake, and he searched the empty house for it, and for the cats. "Perhaps they've motored to Pussy Villa," he thought. "They'll be hungry." So he bought some food and went to the cottage. He waited there all night, hoping the cats would come. At midnight the cats woke up and tried to get out of the suitcase, but Master had locked it. They wondered anxiously where they were, and the kittens began to cry. Suddenly, lots of tiny feet pattered across the lid, and a small voice squeaked through the lock.
"We're the mice from Rabbit's pillow. We hid in Master's furniture because, like you, we don't want to be left behind. Let us live in Pussy Villa, and we'll set you free."
Orlando had to promise, and the mice gnawed big holes in the suitcase, and the cats squeezed out. Pansy and Blanche were very frightened in the enormous dark storehouse, which was full of other people's furniture as well as Master's.
"Pooh, you silly things,"
jeered Tinkle scornfully.
"Fancy being afraid of the dark. It can't hurt you, 'cause it isn't alive."
At that moment, a cuckoo popped out of her clock 12 times, and a sudden draught set a rocking horse rocking. Tinkle was terrified and hid behind his sisters.
"Who's a silly thing now?" they laughed. "They aren't alive either."
Orlando's car was next to the suitcase, and the cats climbed into it, leaving the mice to follow in the furniture later on. The huge storehouse door was locked, but a little one, belonging to Tom the night watchman, was unfastened, and Tom was fast asleep. Orlando drove through it into the street outside. Being a cat's car, it could see better in the dark without lights, so Orlando pressed a button on the steering wheel, and thick eyelashes sprouted over the headlamps to dim the glare. But Orlando did not know which way to go. "We're lost," he sighed in despair. "But perhaps the aerials will help us to find Master," and he pressed another button. Out of the bumper sprang a set of wire whiskers, which immediately began to quiver, for they detected faint noises made by Master a long way off. The eyelashes fluttered, and with a loud snort the car suddenly drove itself in Master's direction. "There's no need to worry any more," purred Orlando happily. "The car knows where to go." He folded his arms and Grace cuddled up beside him, while the kittens slept. The cats reached Pussy Villa at breakfast time, and they were very hungry. Master was in the kitchen, frying fish and toasting cheese. He was so pleased to see the cats, and they were very happy to be with him again. Everybody except Tinkle ate cheese on fish, but he liked fish on cheese. The robin hopped through the window.
"Tweet, tweet, anything to eat?"
he chirruped, for Pussy Villa had been empty a long time, and there had been nobody to feed the poor little bird. Orlando invited him to help himself, and promised that no harm should ever come to him. The builders arrived and made themselves some tea. Then they threw the broken tiles off the roof and pulled up the rotten floorboards. The plumber mended a pipe upstairs, and water poured through the ceiling onto poor Pansy. Blanche was terrified, dashed up the chimney, and came down as black as Tinkle. Tinkle was so surprised that he fell into a bucket of whitewash and crawled out as white as Blanche. "You can't stay here," said Master to Orlando. "You won't be safe anywhere, and the kittens will catch pneumonia. I'll take you to your hotel at once." The hotel was called the Jolly Smugglers, and was quite near Pussy Villa. The cats said good-bye to Master, with big tears in their eyes. The hotel keeper locked them in their room, which opened out into a tiny yard surrounded by a high wire fence. Time passed, and the cats pined for Master. Grace's lovely fur coat no longer shone. Even the flowers in her hat drooped, and she refused to take it or her coat off. "I'll be ready all the sooner," she sobbed, "when Master comes to take us home." The kittens mewed piteously all day long, with never a purr. Orlando decided to find a way out of the Jolly Smugglers, so one night, when the hotel keeper was asleep, he began to dig a hole in the yard. The earth was hard, and made his paws very sore. After some time he had to stop, and he went back to bed. "Whatever have you done to your poor paws?" cried Grace, and she licked them clean and comfortable. Orlando told her about the hole, so she and the kittens helped with the digging. In the daytime, the cats lay across the hole to hide it from the hotel keeper. One night, when Orlando was digging, he suddenly disappeared down the hole.
"Father!"
shrieked Tinkle, and he too vanished. Grace tried to catch him, and also fell out of sight. Pansy and Blanche grabbed their mother's tail and went down with her. They all landed unhurt in a dark and dirty underground passage. "Follow me," sneezed Orlando through his dusty whiskers. The cats trotted along until a big stone blocked their way. "Push!" cried Orlando. They pushed, and suddenly the stone rolled away, taking the cats with it, into a cellar full of old rubbish. Bats, like little crumpled mackintoshes, hung upside down from the cobwebby ceiling, and a rickety ladder led up to the house above. "That must have been a secret passage we came along," said Orlando, "dug a long time ago by smugglers who lived in our hotel. They brought their stolen treasure along the passage and hid it here." All the cats climbed the ladder except Tinkle, who loved rubbish. He stayed behind to poke his nose among old boxes and sacks. They were full of golden pennies. Tinkle filled his pockets with them and staggered up the ladder, weighed down by the heavy coins. The cats were amazed to find themselves back in Pussy Villa, and there was Master worrying over the builder's bill, for he had no money left. A man was laying lino on the floor, and the cats crept beneath it to hide from Master, for they were afraid he would take them back to the hotel. "Why is the lino bumpy?" Master asked the man. "It should lie flat." Master looked underneath, and saw that the bumps were cats. "Oh dear," he groaned. "You're like water in a sieve. Nothing stops you from running away. However, Pussy Villa is mended now, so you can stay." Tinkle gave Master his golden pennies. "Wherever did you get all these?" cried Master. "There's enough to pay the builder." Tinkle showed him the boxes and sacks of money in the cellar, and Master never had to worry about bills again. The van with the furniture and mice arrived, and though Grace's sofa and table went into Pussy Villa quite easily, Master's furniture was far too large. The removers pushed and pulled, but they could not get it round the corners. Orlando tried to help, but twisted his back so badly that Master sent for an ambulance to take him to hospital. The doctor put him into a stiff plaster jacket to straighten his back, and sent him home. Master's furniture was still standing outside Pussy Villa, so Orlando telephoned Mr. Catamole for help. "Don't worry, sir," replied Mr. Catamole. "Tell the removers to take it to the Home for Old Masters. They live in a big house and are in need of furniture. I'll send you some the right size for Pussy Villa." Orlando was quite comfortable inside his jacket, but he could not bend to wash himself, nor see the time on his tail watch. However, Grace and her daughters kept him clean, and Tinkle soon learnt to tell the time. Master had to sleep on the floor that night, for he had no bed. Grace buttered the soles of his boots while he slept, to stop him from straying away to his friends again. Next morning some little packets came from Mr. Catamole, labelled bedroom, dining room, and sitting room, and with them a letter which said, "Dried furniture, place packets on floors, and sprinkle with water." Orlando laid the first packet on Master's bedroom floor and sprinkled it. Everybody sat among the puddles and waited. Queer bumps grew up beneath Master and the cats, which turned into furniture. Grace and the kittens found themselves on a dressing table, while Orlando looked down from the top of a wardrobe, and Master lay on a soft bed.
"I'm hungry,"
mewed Tinkle loudly. So Orlando decided to furnish the dining room next. He sprinkled the packet. Striped wallpaper appeared on the walls, and silver stars spangled the blue ceiling. A huge bump swelled up into a dresser with pretty plates on the shelves, and another grew into a large table laden with the cat's favourite food. Chairs sprouted beneath Master and the cats around the table. Grace took off her hat and coat, for she really felt she was home at last. "Now for the sitting room," purred Orlando, when they'd finished eating. Soon Master was seated in an armchair, toasting his toes before a bright fire, with Grace beside him on her sofa. Bookcases lined the walls, and warm rugs covered the floor. Orlando hung his wedding photograph over the mantelpiece. Suddenly, from an empty corner came a voice saying, "Once upon a time, Possum said to Pussum." It was very frightening, for there was nobody to be seen. But Orlando bravely examined the corner. "Twiddle my whiskers," he cried. "I forgot to sprinkle this corner." Orlando sprinkled the dry patch, and a lump swelled up into a television set, with the kittens' best-loved program on the screen. They watched the adventures of Possum and Pussum reflected in Master's spectacles until it was time for bed. The cats were awakened the next morning by the jingle of harness and rumbling wagon wheels. "Hey!" neighed Vulcan loudly. "Here we be, after travelling all night. We be mighty hungry and thirsty, I can tell 'ee." The cats ran downstairs to welcome their old friends. Orlando opened the kitchen window while Grace filled the sink beneath it with water. The horses put their heads through and drank thirstily. "Thank'ee," snorted Venus politely, nearly blowing the cats off the draining boards. She sucked her moustaches dry, while Cupid licked his velvety lips and dribbled on the path outside. "Got any corn?" whinnied Vulcan hungrily. "Oh, dear," mewed Grace unhappily. "We haven't any at all." Suddenly a lump began to grow where Cupid had dribbled. "Frizz my fringe and fetlocks," neighed Vulcan. "It be a sack of corn." Mr. Catamole had known that the horses were going to live at Pussy Villa, so he had sent a packet of dried corn for them. It had dropped out of the postman's bag onto the garden path. After their meal, the horses pulled the wagon into the field and unpacked something that looked like a barn. The cats wondered what it was, and Vulcan explained, "It be a bung above. Men live in bung belows, but they bain't high enough for horses." It was cold that night, so Orlando and Grace took hot wattles to the horses in bed and tucked them up. At midnight, all the cats of Furry Hill screeched and caterwauled under Orlando's bedroom window. The oldest inhabitant yowled up at him, "Come down and fight. Basher's waiting for you. We won't have any cowardy custard cats living here." "Don't go," implored Grace frantically. "Those fierce cats will surely kill you." "I must, my dear," said Orlando gently, "to prove I'm not a coward." When cats fight, they make themselves look bigger and more frightening by fluffing up their tails and arching their backs. But Orlando could not do this in his stiff jacket, and his enemies jeered at him for being meek. He was very scared of Basher's huge paws, which were like boxing gloves, for he had 6 toes on each one. Basher sprang on to Orlando, scratching, biting, and attacking him again and again. Luckily he could not hurt Orlando's body through the plaster jacket, and at last Basher grew tired. "You've won," he gasped, and all the cats of Furry Hill were overjoyed, for they had always hated Basher, and no cat had ever beaten him before. Orlando's jacket had been cracked in the fight, and when he climbed into bed, it fell off. He was delighted to find his back was quite strong again, and he loved being able to curl up into a tight ball once more. Tenderly, Grace licked Orlando's face until he fell asleep. "Brr, brr,"